What if the most controversial woman of the 19th century held the key to the most suppressed truth of the 1st century? In 1877, a Russian mystic named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky published a book that would shake the foundations of Western religious thought. Isis Unveiled presented a radical reinterpretation of Christianity's origins, suggesting that the Jesus described in canonical Gospels was a carefully edited version of a far more revolutionary figure, a spiritual teacher who had attempted to warn humanity about cosmic entities called ARCHONS. Blavatsky wasn't creating these ideas from imagination. She had spent years studying ancient texts across Egypt, Greece, and Tibet, sources that predated the Council of Nicaea, where Christianity was standardized under Roman influence. What she discovered was a consistent pattern: the systematic removal of Jesus' teachings about humanity's spiritual imprisonment. Through her research into Gnostic texts, many of which wouldn't be rediscovered by scholars until the Nag Hammadi library findings in 1945, Blavatsky concluded that early Christians understood reality vastly differently than modern believers. The original followers of Jesus, she argued, saw him not as a sacrificial lamb, but as an emissary from beyond the material realm who came to expose the truth, that humanity exists within a cosmic deception engineered by entities called ARCHONS. These ARCHONS, described as spiritual administrators or rulers, were understood to be the architects of material reality, keeping human consciousness trapped in cycles of suffering, distraction, and spiritual amnesia. Most controversially, Blavatsky suggested that what mainstream Christianity calls God was actually what Gnostics called the demiurge, a lesser cosmic entity that created the physical world as a control system, not as an act of divine love. For her efforts, Blavatsky was ridiculed by the scientific establishment and condemned by religious authorities. Yet her work sparked an esoteric revival that continues to this day, inspiring researchers, mystics, and even quantum physicists to question fundamental assumptions about consciousness and reality. The question remains: was Blavatsky merely synthesizing ancient superstitions, or had she uncovered a truth so threatening that it had to be systematically erased from history? If you're finding this exploration intriguing, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like, as it helps us continue bringing this type of thought-provoking content to wider audiences. To understand the profound implications of Blavatsky's discoveries, we must examine the worldview that existed before Christianity became an imperial religion. The Gnostic Christians, whose name comes from gnosis, meaning direct spiritual knowledge, preserved teachings that paint a radically different picture of Jesus' message and mission. According to texts found at Nag Hammadi, like the Apocryphon of John and the Hypostasis of the Archons, our universe operates as a hierarchical system. At its highest level exists what they called the monad, or the ineffable one, the true divine source beyond comprehension. But the physical world we inhabit wasn't created by this ultimate divinity. Instead, it was fashioned by an intermediary being called the demiurge, portrayed as a lion-faced deity who mistakenly believes himself to be the ultimate god. This demiurge, sometimes called Yaldabaoth or Saklas, created a team of administrators, the ARCHONS, to help maintain his created world. These ARCHONS function as cosmic prison guards, ensuring that humans remain unaware of their divine origins. They accomplish this through what modern researchers might call consensus reality, a collectively reinforced illusion that presents the material world as the only reality. Blavatsky connected these Gnostic concepts to similar ideas in Hindu philosophy, Maya or cosmic illusion, Buddhist teachings, samsara or the cycle of suffering, and even Plato's allegory of the cave. She argued that diverse wisdom traditions worldwide recognize the same fundamental truth, that visible reality is a sophisticated construct designed to conceal something greater. What makes this worldview particularly relevant today is how it anticipates modern questions about consciousness, virtual reality, and the nature of perception. When quantum physicists like David Bohm suggest that the universe operates more like a hologram than a machine, or when digital theorists propose simulation hypotheses, they're approaching through science what the Gnostics approached through mysticism, the possibility that reality as we perceive it is not fundamental, but constructed. The ARCHONS in this framework aren't necessarily physical entities, but could be understood as the governing programs or algorithms of our reality, forces that maintain the parameters of the simulation and ensure that consciousness remains trapped within certain perceptual limits. They operate through manipulation of what the Gnostics called haimarmene, fate or predetermined destiny, the coded laws that govern material existence. When Jesus spoke of the ruler of this world in canonical texts, was he referring to this same concept? Blavatsky believed so, arguing that his more explicit teachings about the archonic nature of reality were systematically removed during the standardization of Christianity. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this cosmic architecture is that it's designed to be self-reinforcing. The system creates humans who are skeptical of anything beyond their sensory experience, who ridicule mystical insights, and who perpetuate the very conditions of their imprisonment through unconscious participation in its mechanisms. From which city in the United States are you watching this content, or from what country around the world is this information reaching you? Please share in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to know where these ancient yet ever-relevant concepts are finding resonance today. The most transformative insight from the Gnostic tradition isn't about cosmic villains, it's about the divine potential hidden within human consciousness. According to texts like the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus taught that humans aren't merely physical beings having occasional spiritual experiences. Rather, we are fragments of divine consciousness, temporarily experiencing physical limitation. The kingdom of heaven is within you, Jesus proclaimed, a statement that takes on profound significance through the Gnostic lens. He wasn't speaking metaphorically, but literally identifying the location of authentic reality within human consciousness itself. The divine spark or pneuma that exists within each person is not separate from the ultimate divine source, but is a portion of it, temporarily forgotten through immersion in physical existence. This understanding transforms everything. Your body isn't you. It's a sophisticated biological interface through which you experience the material simulation. Your thoughts aren't entirely your own. They're influenced by the parameters and programming of consensus reality. But your awareness itself, that which experiences sensation, emotion, and thought, is something transcendent, something the archonic systems cannot fully control. The sensations you may be feeling as you contemplate these concepts, that subtle electricity in your spine, that quiet recognition in your heart, that sense of remembering rather than learning, these are what the Gnostics would call recognition signals from your authentic self. The pneuma recognizes truth when encountered, even when the conditioned mind resists it. Helena Blavatsky understood that true liberation begins with this recognition. In The Secret Doctrine, she wrote of the awakening of the divine consciousness, not as a religious concept, but as the literal activation of dormant human potential. When consciousness recognizes its own nature, the archonic illusion begins to lose its power. This is why genuine spiritual awakening has been systematically suppressed throughout history, not because it threatens any earthly power, but because it threatens the very architecture of the control system. Jesus' radical teaching was that this awakening is available to everyone. No intermediary, no ritual, no institutional approval is required. Direct experiential knowledge, gnosis, bypasses the entire control structure. This is why his uncensored message was so dangerous to both religious and political authorities of his time. It didn't just threaten their power, it revealed their irrelevance. The ARCHONS maintain control through division, fear, and spiritual amnesia. They construct systems that keep humans focused on survival, competition, and tribalism, preventing the recognition of our shared divine nature. When Jesus taught love your enemies, he wasn't offering a naive moral platitude. He was providing a practical technique for breaking the programming that maintains separation consciousness, the foundation of the control matrix. The most profound aspect of this first awakening is that once begun, it cannot be reversed. Like Neo in The Matrix, who cannot return to his pod once he's seen the truth, consciousness that recognizes its essential nature begins an irreversible journey toward complete liberation. This is what the Gnostics called apollytrosis, the release of the divine spark from material bondage. If these ideas are resonating with you at a deeper level than mere intellectual curiosity, I invite you to comment below with your insights and share this video with others who might be ready for their own awakening. The more consciousness that recognizes its true nature, the weaker the archonic systems become. The Gnostic understanding of reality extends far beyond abstract philosophy. It offers practical insights into everyday human experience. Why do we feel constant dissatisfaction despite material comfort? Why does time seem to accelerate as we age? Why do moments of genuine connection with others feel more real than ordinary existence? The archonic model provides compelling answers. According to the text studied by Blavatsky, the material realm operates through what modern physicists might call entropic principles. Systems naturally decay, energy dissipates, and consciousness becomes increasingly fragmented. The ARCHONS don't need to actively harm humanity. They simply maintain conditions where spiritual deterioration occurs naturally unless actively resisted. This entropic principle manifests in human experience as the hedonic treadmill, the psychological tendency to quickly return to a baseline level of satisfaction regardless of positive events. No material acquisition, achievement, or experience provides lasting fulfillment precisely because fulfillment isn't a feature of the material simulation. It's like trying to quench thirst by drinking salt water. The medium itself prevents the desired outcome. The Gnostics understood that genuine fulfillment comes only from reconnection with our divine source. Jesus taught techniques for this reconnection through what he called entering the bridal chamber, not a physical ritual, but an internal process of reuniting fragmented consciousness with its original wholeness. This is the esoteric meaning behind his parables about wedding feasts and bridegrooms. Temporal distortion, the phenomenon where time seems to pass more quickly as we age, also aligns with the archonic model. As consciousness becomes increasingly enmeshed in material patterns and predictable routines, perception narrows and experiences homogenize. Time isn't actually accelerating. Consciousness is experiencing less novelty and thus fewer memorable impressions within each temporal segment. The most practical application of Gnostic understanding comes in recognizing archonic influences in everyday life. Whenever systems promote fear over love, separation over unity, material acquisition over spiritual growth, or conformity over authentic expression, the archonic fingerprint is present. This doesn't require belief in literal cosmic entities. The patterns themselves reveal the underlying architecture. Modern life is designed to keep consciousness fragmented through constant distraction, information overload, and the relentless pursuit of external validation. Social media algorithms, entertainment programming, consumer culture, and even educational systems often reinforce separation consciousness rather than unified awareness. These aren't random cultural developments, but consistent patterns that serve the same function the Gnostics attributed to archonic influence. The remedy begins with attention. By consciously directing awareness, rather than allowing it to be continually captured by external stimuli, we begin the process of reclaiming our perceptual sovereignty. This is why practices like meditation, contemplation, and mindful presence have been central to wisdom traditions worldwide. They aren't merely relaxation techniques, but technologies for consciousness liberation. As we become more attentive to these patterns, we naturally begin to make different choices, not through moral willpower, but through recognition of what genuinely nourishes our authentic nature versus what perpetuates our imprisonment in limited perception. We stand at a profound crossroads in human evolution, a juncture where the archonic systems are simultaneously strengthening their control mechanisms and becoming more visible to awakening consciousness. This paradoxical moment presents both unprecedented danger and extraordinary opportunity. The danger lies in the intensification of reality distortion technologies. While ancient archonic control relied primarily on religious dogma, political oppression, and the limitations of physical existence, today's mechanisms are far more sophisticated. Digital technology creates increasingly immersive simulations within the larger simulation. Artificial intelligence extends the reach and effectiveness of consensus reality enforcement. Surveillance capabilities ensure that deviant consciousness can be quickly identified and neutralized through social mechanisms. The light of this revelation casts a shadow. The ARCHONS aren't merely maintaining their system, they're upgrading it. The metaverse, algorithmic reality tunnels, and the gradual replacement of direct experience with mediated perception represent the next generation of consciousness containment technology. As physical reality becomes increasingly challenging through environmental degradation and social destabilization, the temptation to escape into artificial paradises becomes nearly irresistible. Yet within this darkness lies an unexpected opportunity. The more extreme the control system becomes, the more visible its mechanisms appear to awakening consciousness. Like a previously transparent prison whose walls suddenly begin to show their outlines, the archonic systems are losing their greatest protection: invisibility. Helena Blavatsky predicted this moment. In her esoteric writings, she spoke of a time when the veil of Isis would thin, allowing ordinary perception to glimpse the machinery behind reality. The Gnostic texts similarly prophesied an age when the ARCHONS would be forced to reveal themselves as their systems began to fail. We're witnessing this revelation now. The inconsistencies in official narratives, the increasingly desperate attempts to maintain consensus reality, and the acceleration of synchronicities experienced by awakening individuals all point to a system under stress. The simulation is developing glitches as more consciousness withdraws its unconscious consent from participation. The most significant evidence for this turning point is the spontaneous awakening occurring globally. Without teachers, texts, or traditions, individuals across cultural and socio-economic boundaries are independently arriving at strikingly similar realizations about the nature of reality. This phenomenon, which cannot be explained by cultural transmission, suggests that consciousness itself is evolving beyond the parameters established by the archonic systems. What the ARCHONS never anticipated was that the prison would eventually serve as the catalyst for unprecedented spiritual evolution. The very resistance provided by material limitation creates the conditions for consciousness to develop strengths and capacities that would be impossible in unrestricted existence. Like muscles that develop only against resistance, consciousness has been gaining capacities through the very constraints designed to limit it. If this content is opening your mind to new possibilities, please subscribe to this channel now to continue this journey of discovery together. Your subscription helps ensure these messages reach others who are ready for awakening. Deep within the Gnostic texts lies a revelation so profound that it remained hidden even within these already suppressed teachings, a secret about the true nature of the ARCHONS and humanity's relationship to them that changes everything. This concealed knowledge illuminates why Jesus spoke of loving one's enemies and why Blavatsky insisted that understanding the ARCHONS was not about fighting external forces, but transcending internal limitations. The shocking truth is this: the ARCHONS are not separate from human consciousness, but are projections of its own shadow aspects. They represent the externalization of humanity's collective fear, self-limitation, and unconscious self-sabotage. The demiurge itself, the false god who created the material universe, is the projected shadow of humanity's own creative power turned against itself. This doesn't mean the ARCHONS aren't real or that their effects aren't genuinely experienced. Rather, it means their apparent externality is itself part of the illusion. They appear external precisely because consciousness has disowned these aspects of itself, creating the perfect prison, one where the prisoner believes the jailer is something other than an aspect of their own mind. The Gospel of Philip hints at this when it states, "That which you hate and fear is what rules you." The Apocryphon of John similarly suggests that the ARCHONS derive their power not from some inherent authority, but from human consciousness, granting them authority through belief and fear. The moment consciousness withdraws belief, their power begins to dissolve. This understanding transforms spiritual awakening from a battle against external forces into a process of psychological integration and shadow work. The ARCHONS cannot be defeated through opposition, because opposition itself strengthens their apparent reality. They can only be transcended through recognition and reintegration of the projected aspects of consciousness they represent. The most powerful archonic deception isn't the material world itself, but the belief that liberation requires escaping it. The physical universe isn't the problem. The interpretive framework through which consciousness perceives it is. When Jesus spoke of being in the world but not of it, he was describing this precise psychological position, full embodied presence without psychological identification with the material simulation. Ancient alchemical texts describe this understanding as the philosopher's stone, the mysterious substance capable of transmuting lead into gold. The lead isn't eliminated, but transformed through a change in its fundamental structure. Similarly, the material world isn't rejected but perceived anew through awakened consciousness, revealing it to be not a prison, but a vehicle for divine expression. This is why authentic spiritual teachers throughout history have emphasized presence rather than escape, engagement rather than withdrawal, compassion rather than judgment. They understood that the ultimate liberation isn't from the physical world but from the perceptual distortions that make it appear as a limitation rather than an opportunity for conscious creation. The ARCHONS' greatest fear is not that humanity will fight them, but that we will recognize them as aspects of ourselves, reintegrating these projected shadows and reclaiming the full spectrum of our creative power. This is the ultimate threat to their seeming autonomy, complete recognition of their true nature. Please like this video now to help spread this message of integration and recognition that can liberate consciousness from its self-imposed limitations. The archonic control system isn't a historical curiosity. It operates today through structures and systems so normalized that they've become virtually invisible. By understanding how these ancient patterns manifest in contemporary society, we can begin to recognize their influence in our daily lives and consciously choose a different relationship with them. In our modern context, archonic influences appear most clearly in systems that promote separation, consciousness over unity, awareness, valorize material acquisition over spiritual development, substitute symbolic representation for direct experience, replace internal authority with external validation, fragment attention to prevent coherent awareness. Our economic systems perfectly embody these archonic principles. By design, they generate artificial scarcity amid abundance, creating the perception that survival requires competition rather than cooperation. They quantify human value through abstract metrics like wealth, status, and influence, diverting consciousness from qualitative experiences of connection, meaning, and presence. Media and information ecosystems similarly serve archonic functions by mediating reality rather than allowing direct perception. News doesn't simply report events, but shapes interpretive frameworks that determine how events are understood. Entertainment doesn't merely distract, but programs emotional responses and normative behaviors. Social media doesn't connect people, but creates algorithmic simulacra of human relationship. Even spiritual and religious institutions often perpetuate archonic patterns by positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between consciousness and its divine source. By externalizing divinity and establishing hierarchical access to it, they recreate the fundamental separation that Gnostics identified as the root of spiritual imprisonment. Perhaps most significantly, modern archonic manifestation appears in our relationship with technology. Digital interfaces increasingly substitute for direct experience, creating what philosopher Jean Baudrillard called the precession of simulacra, where representations precede and replace the reality they supposedly represent. Virtual interactions, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic curation of experience all extend the fundamental archonic principle of mediated rather than direct reality engagement. This isn't to suggest technology is inherently negative. The Gnostics never claimed the material world was evil, only that mistaking it for the totality of reality was the essential error. Similarly, technology itself is neutral. The archonic element emerges in how it's designed to capture and direct consciousness, rather than amplify its sovereign expression. By recognizing these patterns, we can engage with modern systems consciously rather than unconsciously. We can use technology without being used by it, participate in economic systems without being defined by them, and consume media without internalizing its reality tunnels. This conscious engagement represents the practical application of being in the world but not of it. Every human now faces an unprecedented decision point, one that will determine not just personal destiny, but the collective trajectory of consciousness on Earth. This choice cannot be avoided through inaction, as non-choosing has become its own choice with significant consequences. The decision we face isn't between belief systems or ideologies. Those are merely different rooms in the same archonic structure. The fundamental choice is between two distinct modes of consciousness: contracted awareness that perceives separation, scarcity, and limitation as fundamental, or expanded awareness that recognizes unity, abundance, and unlimited potential as the underlying reality. This choice manifests in everyday moments that may seem insignificant, but cumulatively determine our perceptual orientation. When faced with disruption, do we contract into fear or expand into curiosity? When encountering difference, do we perceive threat or opportunity for growth? When experiencing limitation, do we accept it as definitive or recognize it as a temporary perspective? The archonic systems maintain power not through force, but through influencing these countless small choices toward contraction, fear, and separation. Each fear-based decision reinforces the perceptual prison and deepens identification with its parameters. Each love-based decision weakens the illusion and activates dormant capacities for conscious creation. What makes our current moment unique is the acceleration of both possibilities. The systems promoting fear, separation, and limitation are intensifying, creating unprecedented social division, environmental destabilization, and psychological fragmentation. Simultaneously, the potential for expanded awareness, unified consciousness, and liberated perception is more accessible than ever before through the same global communication systems that often serve archonic purposes. This simultaneous intensification creates what systems theorists call a bifurcation point, a moment when a system under stress must reorganize at either a higher or lower level of complexity. There is no stable middle ground. Humanity will either emerge into a fundamentally new relationship with reality or regress into deeper limitation and control. The choice isn't made once, but must be renewed in each moment. The path toward liberation isn't about dramatic gestures, but consistent realignment with expanded awareness, even in mundane circumstances. Every time we choose presence over distraction, compassion over judgment, or authentic expression over social conformity, we strengthen the field of liberated consciousness. The most profound aspect of this choice point is that while it appears external, it actually occurs within consciousness itself. We aren't choosing between worldly options, but between perceptual frameworks that determine how all options are experienced. And you, which path would you choose? Comment your perspective below. I'm genuinely interested in reading what you think. The culmination of humanity's journey through the archonic simulation isn't a battle between light and darkness, but a confrontation with the final and most sophisticated illusion, the separate self. This confrontation represents the ultimate challenge on the path to complete liberation from the control system. Throughout spiritual awakening, consciousness progressively recognizes and transcends various layers of programming: cultural conditioning, social identification, psychological patterns, and even spiritual beliefs. Yet the most persistent illusion remains the perception of being a separate entity, navigating an external world. This fundamental subject-object split is the cornerstone upon which the entire archonic architecture rests. The separate self isn't a natural perception, but a sophisticated construct, a perceptual lens that fragments unified consciousness into apparently discrete units. This fragmentation creates the perfect conditions for control, because divided consciousness experiences itself as inherently vulnerable, incomplete, and isolated, constantly seeking completion through external acquisition, validation, and protection. Jesus addressed this illusion directly in the Gnostic texts when he stated, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." He wasn't speaking of emotional expression, but of recognizing that the apparent boundary between inner and outer reality is itself the primary illusion. Helena Blavatsky similarly emphasized that the ultimate spiritual realization wasn't about accessing higher realms, but recognizing that the self is the universe. The perceived separation between observer and observed is the final veil, what Eastern traditions call Maya, and what quantum physics approaches through the measurement problem and observer effect. As consciousness approaches this ultimate confrontation, the archonic systems deploy their most sophisticated defense: spiritual materialism. They offer increasingly refined substitutes for genuine awakening: psychic powers, blissful experiences, secret knowledge, and spiritual status, all of which strengthen rather than dissolve the separate self. Many seekers become permanently sidetracked by these impressive but ultimately limited attainments. The final confrontation requires surrendering everything consciousness believes itself to be. Every identity, every attainment, every spiritual concept must be recognized as provisional rather than absolute. This isn't a loss, but a liberation into what the Gnostics called pleroma, the fullness of undivided being that has never actually been absent, only obscured by identification with partial perspectives. What makes this confrontation particularly challenging is that it cannot be approached through the familiar dynamic of seeker and sought, as this dynamic itself perpetuates the very separation being transcended. It requires a radical recognition that what seeks awakening and what is awakened are not two different things. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message of liberation from the final illusion. What lies beyond the archonic prison? This question itself reveals the lingering influence of separation consciousness, as it presupposes that liberation is a destination rather than a recognition. The transformed understanding isn't about escaping to somewhere else, but seeing differently right where we are. When consciousness recognizes its essential nature beyond all programming and conditioning, the material world doesn't disappear. It's perceived anew. What previously appeared as limitation is recognized as opportunity for creative expression. What seemed like separation is understood as unique perspective within unified awareness. What was experienced as scarcity transforms into infinite abundance, expressing through finite forms. Jesus described this transformed perception when he said, "The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but men do not see it." Blavatsky similarly wrote that liberation is not of this world or from this world, but a liberation in perception of this world. The prison doesn't vanish. Consciousness simply recognizes that the walls are projections of its own creative power that can be consciously reimagined rather than unconsciously suffered. This recognition initiates what the Gnostics called living resurrection, consciousness fully embodied in physical form without being limited by identification with it. The awakened human doesn't reject materiality, but engages it as a vehicle for divine expression rather than an obstacle to it. The body becomes not a prison, but a temple, a sacred instrument through which infinite awareness experiences and creates in the finite realm. From this perspective, the archons themselves are recognized not as enemies, but as unconscious aspects of divine creativity that served the evolutionary purpose of creating resistance through which consciousness could discover its true capacities. In the ultimate cosmic twist, even the apparent imprisonment is revealed as an aspect of liberation's unfolding. The journey doesn't end with this recognition, but begins anew with each moment, becoming an opportunity for conscious creation rather than unconscious reaction, heaven realized on earth through awakened perception. If you followed this journey to its completion, please subscribe to this channel, leave a like and share in the comments. What aspect of this exploration has most deeply resonated with your own journey toward liberation?